Hi, it's Dennis Daly. There was a wonderful book written 20 years ago called Mothers and Daughters. The two women who wrote the book, one a Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, joined me at my studios in Los Angeles. And later in the interview, we'll hear from their boss, Dr. James Dobson. I want to welcome the two authors of the book, Mothers and Daughters, Carol Celine and Sharon Woolmuth. How did you get started on this second book? What kind of brought all of this together?
Well, after we did our book, Sisters, which was such a wonderful, surprising success, people thought, well, what will you do next? You'll do brothers, you'll do uncles, you'll do in-laws. Mothers and Daughters basically seemed the most natural progression. After all, it is the most central female relationship in a woman's life. And just as we had sisters whom we were very close to and wanted to celebrate that relationship, both of us are daughters, all women are daughters. I'm also the mother of a daughter. This is Carol speaking. And it seemed only natural that we would stay with our own experience.
I think that one's passion and creativity go hand in hand, and having hopefully both of those things, we've really created two books that have joyfully touched women's lives.
Mothers and Daughters are really the theater of reality. There isn't an emotion in that relationship that doesn't get played out. You have love and hate and competition and jealousy and devotion and joy, and it's all there.
I saw something the other day on the street, which I've been holding in my memory bank for now, and that was 4 generations of a family shopping. And I've often wondered what it's like, because I forget the moment when my parents explained to me that my grandmother, and I only knew one of my 4 grandparents, was my father's mother, and that my father used to be a little boy. You know, I remember in a way having a hard time coping with that. Is there not kind of that magic moment when a daughter goes into womanhood, where she suddenly realizes that this greater facet of her life that her mother is now an expert at is something she's going to have to learn?
Well, I think it's wonderful that you're talking about this, is because the very first essay and photograph in the book is about 4 generations, and it is the moment when the 4th generation daughter is brought into the world. Mother just gave birth to a beautiful baby daughter, and we were there at the moment the great-grandmother, the grandmother, walked into the room and saw this precious gift of another generation.
I was immediately brought in mind my own grandson, who is 2 years old, and my daughter, who tries to explain to him that I am her mommy and the other grandmother is daddy's mommy. And he says the words, but I'm not sure that he understands what they mean. And I'm looking forward to the point where he'll ask me, as I used to ask my grandmother, tell me what mommy was like when she was little. I think for a woman, the moment where she really begins to understand her mother usually comes when she has children herself.
I don't want to get too far afield here, but I'm reminded of a photograph. When my grandmother died, we all went to the house, started going through the belongings, and I found a photo of an extremely thin woman dressed in black who must have been about 17, and there on a stool beside her was a child in a white dress, maybe 2 years old. And I looked at that and I said, that woman is my sister. I realized, no, it's not my sister, but it's somebody back in the family who at that age looked like my sister. And they said, it's your grandmother. Well, I knew my grandmother as this large Marjorie Main Maw Kettle kind of woman. And the scary thing was, the little child was my father, because my grandmother had been married when she was barely 16, on the farm. But the reason I bring this up is quite often you have almost a scary resemblance. And sometimes it skips a generation, but sometimes you will see a mother and daughter, those classic soap commercials where they look alike. Carol Celine and Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist Sharon Woolmuth. They have written a wonderful, wonderful book called Mothers and Daughters, and before that they had a best-selling book out there called Sisters. Nice ladies, let me continue talking about what we were talking about before. I mentioned the fact that my sister at one time bore a striking resemblance to my grandmother when she was that age, and you were beginning to tell me about the significance of photos.
It's amazing that you're talking about a photograph. I found a photograph of my great-grandmother Ida, who never made it to America. She was in a small village in Poland. And for the author photo, I photographed Carol, and she's so blessed to have her mother and a daughter. And my mother died 5 years ago, and I never had children of my own. So I decided to make sort of a montage of the generations of women who I really love and respect. And one of them was my great-grandmother Ida, and then next to her, these are all separate photographs. My grandmother, Rose, and my mother, Rebecca, and myself. And I look at my great-grandmother Ida, and I see such a resemblance that it's really scary.
Well, the sad thing is, I'm beginning to look like my grandmother, and she was not a very attractive man.
You're very handsome.
You know, my daughter looks a great deal like me. We're built the same. We have the same frame, the same color hair. We can share each other's clothes. And I used to love it when people thought we were sisters. I loved it. She didn't. And I think that's a real central issue in the mother-daughter relationship. Sometimes it's fun to look like your mom, but basically the work for daughters is to differentiate. The work for daughters is to separate and not be their moms.
In your dealings with mothers and daughters, how different have you found modern society to be from the time when we were like the Waltons, where there were not only extended families, but we shared the same roof, and you had the proximity of the very young child with the older person, and much more of that understanding, I think, because you were with them more?
Well, I think that there's a lot. The family values in this country are a lot deeper than television and the outrageous press would have us believe. Many of the families that we went into, while they may have been considered dysfunctional since they were not whole, there was a single mother raising a child or a divorced mother, the association and attachment to the grandmother, a mother of a grown child would still talk about her mother with great sweetness and longing. And when you could get the generations mixed together, there was great tenderness and great love. I think that the difference between the generations is more in the way that contemporary mothers deal with their children. I think that the older generation of mothers tended to hide their feelings a lot more. They didn't want to reveal themselves to their daughters. Mothers today tend to be more open, more willing to tell their daughters what they're really feeling, more willing to engage in dialogue.
So not having been a daughter, I missed out on some pretty important chit-chat.
Oh, you surely did.
And on great shopping.
Well, I have a son, too, I must say, and I've had wonderful talks with him. But we don't shop together the same way I do with my daughter. And the difference is very often physical. I'm much more comfortable touching my daughter and hugging her and sharing. I would climb into bed with her. I wouldn't climb into bed with my son.
Do you find, though, that there are people who will say that daughters are closer to their father and sons are closer to their mother?
I think these are all generalizations without any basis other than the family.
Oh, yes, I think it does depend on the family.
It happens that I was much closer to my father than my mother, and my sister was closer to my mother.
Maybe I'm judging that from the fact that my father has been dead about 12 years, and it devastated my sister. But I took it in stride. Maybe I haven't mourned yet. I mean, maybe sometime down the road it'll hit me that he's no longer... And I was not home when he died. She was. She was still back in Indiana, so maybe that had something to do with it.
Also, it may be that you had completed your work with him, whatever work that was for you, and her work with him was not finished. And maybe that's why the absence or gap feels more poignant.
How did you pick the people? How did you get these stories?
Well, we're both journalists, and we wanted to have a wonderful mix of stories of love and hate and competition and every emotional feeling there is. People wrote to us. We say that the stories came to us by intention and accident, and we were very lucky that people called us and told us their stories. We have stories about adoption and caretaking, and a lot of the stories we had to go after. As I said, caretaking, we called geriatric places and nursing homes, and we wanted to get that kind of story. We have a story about loss, a mother who lost her daughter. And with the success of Sisters, so many women wrote to us and said, you know, I have an incredible mother-daughter story. And by accident, I was driving around Rittenhouse Square one day in Philadelphia, and I saw this flash of green, and I stopped the car and I looked to the left, and there was a young woman with green hair, really punk looking, and
her nose, her ears, her eyes were pierced.
Everything was pierced, and ran out of the car and ran across the park, and I said, "Hi, I know you have a mother."
And hopefully she looks very conservative, which she
was
did.
in our book, and Carol has an interesting story also.
Well, we discover people by accident in that my mother was having cataract surgery, and the doctor's assistant was telling me that we should have had her aunt and her mother and her 9 sisters in our sister's book, and then went on to start to talk about her granny, who was this fabulous woman who was 96 years old, the matriarch of the family. Every Saturday they would all get together with their covered dish supper, and I thought, whoa, that would be great for mothers and daughters, because we always know what we're working on next. And so I made notes and called them when the book came out. So we're very, very finicky about the mix in our books. We want to visualize the books as a giant quilt, and each of the stories is a separate piece of fabric that you see a little bit of yourself and all of the stitching, and when you're finished reading them, you get this sense of what the grandmother-daughter relationship is all about.
We can see this evolving into our next book, which is Best Friends, and on this trip across the country, we've talked to several people who have said, I have a great best friend story, and we sort of look at each other and say, okay, tell us your story. And we now have at least 4 or 5 stories that are so remarkable and wonderful that we will be coming back, and these folks will be in our book.
People like to talk to us, and I think it's because we write about relationships, and we have an openness toward people that encourages them to just reveal themselves.
And they trust us.
You mentioned the word quilt there. I guess I draw too many of my own recollections into things, but I'm picturing my grandmother again, quilting.
What was her name?
Her name was Matilda Essig. That was her maiden name. Actually, she was a Dant. I forgot about that. She was a Dant and married a Daly and had my father, and then my grandfather died under very mysterious circumstances. They still will not tell me how my grandfather died. I guess he was a horse thief, maybe.
I have a question. You have mentioned your grandmother several times, and you haven't said much about your mother.
Oh, gee, I don't know. My mother is, I'm thinking about writing a book. My mother is in a nursing home now. She's 84, and she's just at the point when I was through Indiana the last time. It took her about 20 seconds to know who I was. So I'm going through that withdrawal right now.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting psychologically that maybe I'm not talking about her because I can't...
You anticipate.
Yeah,
yes,
don't want to cope with that
yes,
right now.
I spent 8 years of being a caretaker for my mother, not only a caretaker, but a long-distance caretaker. And you do. I understand that feeling of withdrawing, because you just know that down the line pretty soon.
Yeah, and even though she tells me I'm the best son in the world, I feel as if I've abandoned her to some extent.
You
so
have
I'm going
not.
through a lot of
If
that
she
now.
is in a safe place and getting good care, you have not abandoned her. You've done the right thing, and that's a very difficult thing to do.
I often asked daughters what they've done for their mothers, and the universal answer was not enough. I think that children who have been blessed to have mothers who've been wonderfully giving never feel they can do enough to say thank you and to give back.
My mother's an interesting woman. She won the Indiana State High School Typing and Shorthand Championship.
Wow!
three years in a row, back in the 1920s or 30s or whatever it was. And then she got married, and my father said to her that I don't think you should work. You know, this is not necessary. I will work in the basement of Montgomery Ward for 38 years.
My wife doesn't have to
My
work.
wife doesn't have to work. And so I tell this story a lot. All of her sisters were secretaries also, and they would write to each other in shorthand. And my mother would place this letter on the table that my Aunt Pauline had sent, and my dad would look at it and go, "Are they talking about me? Is the word Joe in there someplace?"
It probably stared out with "Dear Sir." I just have to. After you told us the story, I've just fallen off my chair, because when I finished high school, I went up to a junior college up in Boston, and where they taught shorthand and typing. And I thought that was just the silliest thing that one had to learn. So after 3 months of being in this secretarial school, they called my parents and said that I just was not the material for them.
She
And
wasn't secretarial material.
Thank God, I was kicked out because I could not learn shorthand and typing. I think the only symbol I learned was "Dear Sir."
Well, I can do Dennis. It's a Den blend, D-N-S.
You have to teach me how to do that.
But, my mother taught me to type when I was in 5th grade, and I used to be about 100 words a minute on a manual typewriter. I love typing. Can't stand computers because I tend to type 5 letters at once. You need a special computer for 50-year-old men who used to bang on manual typewriters. But my mother
sell about 6.
My mother didn't teach me shorthand. And I would have loved, being a reporter, I would have loved to have learned shorthand.
Yeah. I almost took a speed writing course once because as a reporter it was so difficult to get the information down. But then, thank goodness, they came out with tape recorders and we don't...
And the rest is history, as they say. Nice ladies, what was the reaction to the release of this book? What kind of feedback have you gotten from people?
So wonderful.
We consider it truly a gift to us. People are buying the book as a gift for Mother's Day in celebration of their relationships with their mothers, their daughters, their grandchildren. And we do consider it a gift to us that people are sharing this book with us and saying to us, you are changing our lives, you are fixing a relationship, you are helping us celebrate our relationship. And we found that happened in Sisters, and now we're seeing that with mothers and daughters. So we feel blessed that this is happening. The response has been overwhelming.
Women are buying it to give to new mothers, a mother who just has a daughter, a wonderful baby gift, birthday gifts. When we first created Sisters and went on to do Mothers and Daughters, we had in our minds that if you really want to give your sister at that time, and now certainly your mother, a gift that says I love you, perfume and talcum powder and a new nightgown just doesn't do it. But these books put into words what women feel. And by giving a book like this to your mom, you're saying to her all the things that you may never have verbalized. And I think that's why these books have such a strong reaction. We never, when we do signings, simply sign our names. And people often won't remark.
We write volumes.
We always personalize them. And that's because we know that these gifts feel very personal. People leave them on their coffee tables, which is a wonderful compliment to us.
Sure.
But you don't put your nightgown that you got from your daughter out on the coffee table.
And people tell us all the time their stories. We found that with Sisters and now Mothers and Daughters. And there isn't a day goes by that we're touched, that we clutch our chest and say, we'll reach out. Somebody will tell me that they have a mother in a nursing home, or they're caring for a mother, or it's so emotional and overwhelming, and we're so thrilled.
You mentioned I hadn't mentioned my mother, and now all the time you're talking, things are running around the back of my mind. I can remember, though, that my mother it was very important to her to tell me about her mother, who died when she was 13, but whom, of course, I never met. And I remember she had such wonderful stories. They lived near the railroad track, and my mother told me that after her mother died, there was a progression of hobos who knocked on the back door, many of them black, and my mother wasn't aware of the fact that her mother had a reputation for feeding anybody who would knock on the door. And the word got around in the hobo community that her mother had died, and they were coming by to thank the family.
Oh, isn't that wonderful? I suspect that your mother wanted not only you to know how wonderful your grandmother was, but in telling you the stories, it was a way for her to affirm the relationship and what her mother meant to her.
And to also pass it on.
How important is it to verbalize? I mean, I said I'm working on things. I'm actually wanting very much to write a book about my dad. This is not a good time to get into this. He was a remarkable man, and as I say, worked for Montgomery Ward for 38 years. I don't think he ever asked for a raise. But how important is it to sit down and, if not tell the story orally, write down your loving feelings, your remembrances about someone else?
Well, I will tell you a story that when I was working on the book, I thought that before I started on the interviews that I should talk to a psychiatrist to maybe gain some insights into mothers and daughters that I might not have from my own experience. And one of the things she said to me is that problems exist very often with mothers and daughters for daughters who don't know their mother's stories. They don't really know what their mother's hopes and dreams and disappointments were. Not that I grew up here and went to school here, but what was life like for your mother? And I tried in some of the interviews to bring that out, and I found that it was a wonderful way to open a dialogue. So I think that writing down, sharing your feelings would be my first choice. Sitting down with your mom, that's why so many people are doing oral histories today, because they want the stories. But I think if you and your mom can talk about not just what you did, but how you felt about things. Very often daughters are like a mother's clay. We tried to mold our daughters to be all the things that we wished we had and didn't have, or we want to remake the relationship we had with our own mother. And if we don't verbalize and talk about what those desires are, they often come out in actions that don't make a lot of sense or cause a lot of hurts.
I think that we perceive our mothers as just a mother, somebody who mothers us, who cooks for us and fixes our hair and those wonderful things. But it took me a long time to realize that my mother was really, she started off as a child, a young woman with her own dreams, and later on in life got married, and then she had us as a family. And she had feelings that I did not know about. And I think when you know your mother's story, your family's story, that there's room to forgive, because you say, God, I didn't realize it was so difficult for you. I'm sure that, a lot of our mothers were from homes that were very difficult, whether it was during the Depression or there were great difficulties, and people react to those situations. So you could have a mother who is particularly not sensitive or doesn't communicate well, but when you find out their stories, you say, oh, now I understand.
Is there much of a difference culturally as far as traditions of sharing? I mean, I was picturing an Italian mother cooking,
You're thinking the story in the book where there are the three generations of women, and I say that the ties that bind them are made of kitchen string.
But is there a propensity in some cultures to be more cross-generationally sharing than there is in others?
Well, I think we know that in Italian cultures, the grandmom often lives in the house or spends a lot of time there. I think there's a lot of tradition in Jewish cultures. In black families, there's a lot of intergenerational connection. And we have a Native American family in the book. We're very, very connected to each other and to their heritage. And then I think that there are some families where withholding is more there. It may be more a question of style than anything else. I wouldn't want to attribute it to any ethnic group in particular, but those ethnic groups who tend to be more boisterous and
have a
exuberant,
lot of family dinners,
family parties.
Do you find much difference in the relationship between mothers and daughters when the father isn't there?
Well, I think it can go two ways. It very often is a factor in drawing them closer together because they only have each other. We have a number of stories in the book. One in particular comes to my mind, a mother raising a daughter. A father walked out when the little girl was 3 months old, and she says if she never saw him again, that would be fine with her because she's got such a great mom who is like a dad as well. She even sent her a Father's Day card once. We have another story of a woman whose husband said to her after they were married 20 years, this marriage is over and you're out of here and I'm keeping the kids. And he had the money and the girls all stayed with him, and one by one they all came back to mom. So when there is no father, I think that the relationship with the mother becomes more important. I don't want to say it's deeper because I think that there are many women who are raised by a mother and father who love them equally.
My special guests are the co-authors of a brand new book called Mothers and Daughters, award-winning Pulitzer Prize-winning photojournalist Sharon Woolmuth and award-winning journalist Carol Celine. What has the book meant to you? You talk lovingly about the first book, Sisters. What has it meant to you psychologically to go through all this, and then to see it in print? As I look to writing my first book sometime in the next 50 years, I'm envisioning in my mind what it must feel like when you first see the dust cover and everything.
For me, I remember seeing for both books just taking the book, and I had tears in my eyes and embracing it, and just holding it up to my heart and stroking it. And for me, it was truly like giving birth. I mean, months and months and months of hard work and worry, and just like you would be having a child. And then here you're holding this
Creation.
wonderful gift, and I guess for me, thinking that I feel so blessed to have had the kind of mother I had, and my grandmother, who I was very blessed, to know. So I feel wonderful to know that I come from a line of fantastic, loving women.
This is my 5th book, and I can tell you that the excitement when this arrived in my hands was no less than the very first book that I had ever done. There was a famous writer, I can't remember her name, who said that when she got a hold, it was James Barrie, it was that he used to carry the book around in his pocket and keep taking it out and looking at it because he was afraid the ink would fade. It is an absolutely monumental feeling to produce a book, but more wonderful is to have the book loved by other people.
Let me get into a few quick questions here as we wrap things up. The importance, again, of nurturing that relationship, and if you don't have one, remembering that person's not going to be around forever.
Oh, I think that's critical. If there is one thing that's universal about mothers and daughters, it is the need to be connected. And even when the relationships aren't good, you see this desire to try to find a way to work it out till
It's
the
always
very
there.
end. I guess if we could give advice about anything, it would be to say, don't wait.
Mm-hmm. And it's amazing how much the tabloid shows are filled with people trying to find their mothers. The people who were given up for adoption never knew who their parents were. I mean, it's almost...
We want to know where we came from.
We say that this umbilical cord is never cut, that it's stretched, it's twisted, but
It's frayed.
it's frayed, it's never cut. And there was a woman, I guess, was it Joni Collins, I'm not sure who it was, who found her she had a daughter when she was 16 and gave her daughter up for adoption. And just recently they were reunited. And she said in an interview also that this is an umbilical cord that is never cut.
Where next now? You mentioned where you're going with your next book.
We're doing Best Friends next.
Have you gotten many interviews yet on that?
We were just in the car coming over here and making our list, and I think we're pretty well along with our choices.
What follows that? Worst enemies?
No,
I want to do something on grandparents, but who knows?
I heard that. Maybe you can find it. Somebody did a thing, What is a Grandmother? And it was interesting because...
You're looking at her.
Part of it is to explain to the small child that this is a female. That in a way, when grandparents reach a certain age, it's kind of a being that they are. There's not necessarily any sexuality connected with that. But, you didn't know my grandmother. That was the...
Well, and you know me, and
Yes.
I'm a grandmother, and I wouldn't want to be seen like
That-
I think being a grandmother is a whole other wonderful story. You have all the freedom to love and none of the responsibility to discipline.
And the wonderful thing about our Carol and my relationship is that my stepdaughter is married to Carol's son, and so that when we will share a grandchild.
Well, now
That's a book, isn't
So
it?
we're related.
Well, then you've got cousins and in-laws and next-door neighbors. I mean, you could go on forever.
We thought we'd
with
do a
this.
spoof on our own work, actually, involving all those relationships.
Well, listen, it's a beautiful book. It's a wonderful coffee table book. Great photographs, very, very sensitive narrative, and it's the perfect thing for Mother's Day. But it holds up all year.
I hope so.
Thank you so
Thanks so much for
much.
having us.
Thank you very much.
And the two women involved in this project, mothers and daughters, work out of Focus on the Family in Fort Collins, Colorado. The longtime director, Dr. James Dobson. I had the chance to spend a few moments with him.
How much has the American family deteriorated during the 20 years you've been doing Focus on the Family? How much more burden on good old mom?
10 years ago, we dealt with easy problems. We were hearing about thumb sucking and bedwetting and those kinds of things. Now we're hearing these terrible stories of violence in the family and divorce and conflict and prolonged depression and child abuse, molestation of women. We're just seeing a much more difficult scene now socially than we were just a decade ago.
You know, I was in a conversation with some friends of mine last week, and I posed the question to myself, what happened to my generation? I guess if we stretch it a little bit, our generation, were we the ones who dropped the ball? I mean, I came from a rather Ozzie and Harriet, religious-oriented family. I don't feel personally responsible for what's happened in the last 30 years, but yet it was my generation in many ways that, as I say, let this decline happen.
Yeah, it's far more complicated than just calling it dropping the ball. That puts the blame somewhere, and I'm really not comfortable in doing that. But as the very speed at which people run increases, the fallout, the family problems also increase. So you get a heated up society where we're all running and huffing and puffing, and we're just exhausted. Husbands and wives don't have time to talk to one another, to be together, to show love for each other. The children don't know who they are. Their values are not understood because the parents don't have time to communicate it to them. I see that as the greatest threat to the family, is simply the fatigue and time pressure that is so common in this culture. But then, of course, there are many, many other sources to it. The drug problem and alcohol abuse, and then the government itself has not been family friendly in many ways.
I know as you were saying that, I was picturing my aunts and uncles. I remember as a kid visiting them, and they all had nice houses, and we would barbecue outside. But as I looked at that, I suddenly realized that the husband worked, the wife didn't have to, and they had a much higher standard of living than I have. And when you have that situation of both parents having to work, some of them 1 or 2 jobs, who's left at home?
Well, and let me give you another example of that. In 1949, I was 13 years of age, and my father was a college professor, and he didn't make much money. It was a small college, and we were about at the median income. Yet my mother did not work. She was home with me, and there weren't those kind of pressures on the family. And when my mother died a few years ago, I got into the records from my family, and I saw that in 1949, my parents paid $2.49 every 2 weeks in federal taxes. Now you know what's happened. This tremendous tax burden has been dropped on families, and they have to work 5 months out of the year just to pay the government. That has forced many people to moonlight, many women to go back to work who honestly would not choose to do so.
Dr. James Dobson, thank you for joining us from your Focus on the Family headquarters in Colorado Springs.
Mothers and Daughters, a really interesting book that was compiled all across the nation. I'm Dennis Daly.